The moment diplomacy is framed as talks under threats, you're not negotiating terms anymore. You're negotiating status. Who's coercing whom? Who gets to set the conditions? Who blinks first? And that's why this latest Al Jazeera headline matters. Tehran is rejecting talks under threats, while Trump says the blockade stays. On the surface, it sounds like a standard standoff. Iran says it won't negotiate under pressure. The US says pressure will continue. End of story. But that's not what this is. This is a lock-in moment where both sides publicly choose a posture that makes compromise harder, not easier. Because once one side says, we don't talk under threats, any meeting becomes a humiliation risk. And once the other side says the blockade stays, any flexibility becomes a weakness risk. So the conflict stops being about what each side wants in the end, and becomes about what each side can't afford to be seen doing right now. And here's what most people miss. When leaders speak this way, they aren't only speaking to each other, they're speaking to three audiences at the same time. Domestic audiences, who punish concessions during crisis allies and partners, who need predictability and reassurance. Markets and commercial actors, who move money in ships based on risk. That's why this matters beyond rhetoric. A blockade is not just a military posture, it's an economic instrument. It's a way of applying pressure without firing a shot, by controlling access, raising costs, and narrowing options. And a refusal to talk under threats is not just pride. It's a demand to change the negotiating environment, remove the pressure first, then we'll speak. So when these two statements appear in the same news cycle, Tehran rejects talks under threats, Trump says blockade stays, you're looking at a crisis where both sides want diplomacy to be the other side's surrender. And that's a dangerous arrangement because the longer the standoff lasts, the more the pressure shifts away from diplomats and toward the system. Shipping risk, energy pricing, insurance costs, regional military posture, proxy activity, and the probability of an incident that forces escalation whether anyone wants it or not. Tonight I'm going to break down what talks under threats actually means, what blockade stays means in practical terms, why these positions are designed to shape behavior far beyond the negotiating table, and what happens next. Because in standoffs like this, the next phase is rarely announced. It's felt first in the movement of ships, the pricing of risk, and the tightening of rules of engagement. Let's translate the language into mechanics, because the mechanics are where the leverage lives. When Tehran says it rejects talks under threats, it's drawing a bright line around coercive diplomacy. It's saying, if you want dialogue, you must first stop acting like you can choke us into it. This is a classic posture in high-stakes negotiations because it attempts to reverse the sequence. Instead of pressure first, talks later, Iran is arguing for de-pressure first, talks later. But here's the problem. The US side often believes pressure is the only thing that creates movement, which is why Trump's response, blockade stays, is a direct attempt to deny Iran that sequence reversal. Now, what does blockade actually mean in modern practice? It can mean different things depending on how it's implemented and how it's described publicly. Formal blockade language, rare, legally heavy, politically escalatory, functional blockade behavior, intensified inspections, interdictions, exclusion warnings, and the credible threat of force that changes maritime behavior, economic blockade effects, insurance spikes, shipping delays, rerouting, and higher costs that effectively reduce trade, even without total stoppage. In other words, you can have blockade effects without a single dramatic "we declare a blockade" moment. And the biggest weapon isn't always interception, it's uncertainty, because uncertainty forces the private sector to self-restrict. That's why these public statements are not just for headlines, they are designed to move the risk dial. Tehran's line, no talks under threats, is also aimed at third parties. It's a message to neutral states and trade-dependent economies. If you want stability, pressure Washington to reduce coercion. It's an attempt to turn the global desire for calm into diplomatic leverage. Trump's line, blockade stays, is aimed at the same third parties in the opposite direction. We are maintaining control and enforcement. We won't be pushed into concessions by disruption. It's meant to signal resolve and deter Iran from believing it can win by raising costs. So what you're watching is not talks stalled. You're watching a fight over who controls the conditions under which talks can even begin. And that fight tends to produce two dangerous outcomes. Diplomacy becomes performative. Each side sets conditions the other can't accept publicly. Pressure migrates to the operational domain, shipping lanes, choke points, proxy fronts, cyber pressure, and incidents that create bargaining advantage. Because if you can't win at the table, you try to win by reshaping the table. That's the logic. Now here's the part that separates sophisticated crisis coverage from basic headline reading. Both sides may still be communicating through backchannels, even as they publicly reject each other. In fact, that's common. Public rigidity paired with private probing. But the danger is this. Even with backchannels, if the public posture hardens too far, leaders become trapped by their own words. And once leaders are trapped, the system becomes more likely to drift toward an accident because it's harder to pause operations without looking like you caved. So blockade stays plus no talks under threats is a recipe for one thing: a longer standoff with higher incident probability. Not necessarily a planned escalation, but an environment where escalation becomes easier to trigger. Now let's talk about what happens next, because in a situation like this, there are only a few realistic paths, and each path has clear signals. Path 1, quiet procedural talks without public concessions, the backchannel workaround. This is the most plausible good outcome in the short term. Publicly, both sides maintain their lines. No talks under threats, blockade stays. Privately, intermediaries carry messages that establish rules of the road, deconfliction, boundaries, limited sequencing steps. The goal is not a grand deal. The goal is preventing a miscalculation while both sides preserve face. What it looks like: intermediaries start using procedural language, channels, technical discussions, framework, avoid misunderstandings, a slight reduction in the most escalatory rhetorics, more disciplined messaging from officials, small practical accommodations that don't look like lifting the blockade but reduce friction. Path 2. The blockade becomes the negotiation. Pressure continues. Talks remain frozen. This is the slow grind scenario. The US keeps enforcement tight. Iran refuses talks under that posture. The conflict shifts into economic and maritime pressure contests. This is where risk becomes structural. Shipping and insurance costs rise, rerouting increases, and third parties begin pushing harder for restraint because they're paying the bill. What it looks like? Persistent maritime advisories and elevated insurance premiums, more frequent harassment or incident reports. Markets react to every rumor, then partially calm, never fully resetting. Political messaging becomes more absolutist, less technical. Path 3. A catalytic incident forces a decision, escalation through contact. This is the dangerous path, and it often begins without intent. A close approach at sea, an interception, a drone sighting, a strike attributed to a proxy, a cyber disruption, anything that forces leaders to respond publicly. Once that happens, the no talks under threats line hardens further, and blockade stays becomes blockade expands. What it looks like? Sudden traffic slowdowns in sensitive corridors, emergency diplomatic meetings, visible posture changes, escorts, expanded patrol language, sharper warnings, rapid blame cycles that make backing down politically difficult. Now here's the key insight. These paths aren't determined by what leaders want. They're determined by what leaders feel they can afford. And right now, both sides are signaling they can't afford to be the one who yields first. Tehran is saying, we won't negotiate while you hold a knife to our throat. Trump is saying, the knife stays, because otherwise you learn coercion works. That is a classic escalation trap. It's not about ideology, it's about precedent. If one side believes that easing pressure invites future defiance, it won't ease. If the other side believes that talking under pressure invites future coercion, it won't talk. So if this is going to stabilize, it will likely stabilize through something neither side has mentioned in the headline: mechanisms, procedures that reduce incident risk without requiring either side to publicly surrender its storyline. Because in modern crises, peace is too big for the first move. The first move is usually deconfliction and containment, and if you don't get containment, the system becomes the negotiator. Markets, shipping behavior, insurance pricing, and allied pressure start forcing choices that diplomacy failed to structure. Here are the indicators that will tell you, quickly, whether this standoff is heading toward controlled containment or uncontrolled escalation. And watch behavior, not bravado. First, shipping behavior and routing. Are ships transiting normally through key lanes, or are they bunching up outside sensitive corridors? Are there visible delays and holding patterns? In maritime crises, the private sector is the earliest truth signal because it reacts to risk faster than governments admit it exists. Second, insurance and maritime advisory language. This is where fear becomes policy. When advisories shift from elevated caution to avoid transit, that's functional closure without a formal announcement. Premiums that spike and stay high tell you the market expects sustained danger. Third, enforcement patterns. Even without classified details, you can often detect posture through public reporting. More inspections, more detentions, more warnings, more escort talk. If blockade stays is followed by visible tightening, Iran's incentive to refuse talks increases, and the chance of contact incidents rises. Fourth, intermediary diplomacy tone. When stabilization is real, intermediaries sound like engineers, not activists. Technical teams, framework, channels, avoid misunderstandings. When escalation is coming, intermediaries go silent or start issuing warnings. Fifth, the language shift in official statements. This is subtle but reliable. If you start hearing conditional language, if, provided that, steps, phased, It suggests space for sequencing. If you hear absolutist language, no, never, will remain, will respond, it suggests leaders are locking themselves in. Now connect that back to the headline. Tehran rejects talks under threats. Trump says blockade stays. That is not a dead end. It's a pressure configuration. It can still produce talks, but likely not in the form people imagine. It can produce quiet deconfliction measures, limited humanitarian or consular channels, phased steps that are described differently by each side, talks about talks that avoid public humiliation. Or it can produce the opposite, a longer standoff where maritime and economic pressure becomes the main language and diplomacy becomes something both sides reference but neither side can enter without losing face. And that's why this is a critical moment. Not because a deal is imminent, but because the conflict is being framed in a way that increases the probability of drift toward incidents, drift toward escalation, drift toward decisions made under pressure rather than decisions made through structure. The headline sounds like no talks. The reality is more precise. No talks on those terms. And terms are exactly what both sides are fighting over.